Rubble's kennel lurched violently. Another powerful slam ricocheting off the inner walls. Zuma jumped backwards, confused and terrified. Feral instincts screaming at him yet to run. He remained paralyzed in fear. Marshall and Rocky quickly withdrew back to their own kennels as the noise sounded again. Whatever was inside Rubble's den, it was angry and powerful, charging itself into every surface to break free from the prison. The shutter door acted like as the entrance to the kennel was meaningless. A display of power was in order. The creature wanted to break out, tear down the walls and rip its scaffolding to shreds. It wasn't just desire to escape. It wanted to reveal itself. Chase could hardly believe what he was hearing, and with every effort in his small body, he pushed back the crippling horror inside and called out to the Labrador, "Zuma, get back!" The lab finally come to, snapping back to reality as he shook his head. He quickly turned tail and ran, charging away from the kennel and diving into his own. Chase took a few steps back, looking to the door of the tower, mind racing if he could get there in time. Another bang. The kennel's walls began to jut out awkwardly, sliding, bending. A lingering feeling began to possess the air around them. A horrific shriek of confusion and terror. Chase's heartbeat skipped over itself, its own thumps feeling like punches to the head. Its breathing intensifying as its mind fought to keep control of his body. His vision seemed to blur, but this time he knew he wasn't going crazy. Ferox was real. He couldn't abandon his friends. Not now. Holding his breath, the shepherd turned and charged as fast as he could to Marshall's kennel. The Dalmatian was still cowering in the back, keeping his face hidden in his paws, as if looking up was a death sentence. Chase entered the kennel swiftly and nearly threw himself against the wall, almost flattening himself against it. His heart beating like mad, he slowly moved his head, looking out from the firefighter's den. The banging had stopped and the creature was silent. What was Ferox's dog? Human? And he thought back to the image Cyrus had slipped to him not so long ago. He remembered seeing how he only assumed was just a small dog. The head was visible in the photo, but it assumed to be the only part of the body intact. Everything from the neck down was all bone, blood, veins, and muscle. That was what Cyrus had said. Chase couldn't say anything from this view, just still standing kennel that had belonged to a now deceased bulldog. "What's it doing?" Chase muttered to himself, daring to push himself a little farther out. The noise had gone silent. Was the monster truly unable to escape the kennel? "Chase!" He heard him behind him, nearly making him jump. Marshall had picked his head up ever so slightly, exposing his invulnerable blue eyes. "What is that thing?" His voice could barely keep up with his own breaths. The shepherd tried to explain. "I'll stay here. I need to call Cyrus." The sentence had only barely left his mouth when Chase stopped cold, a realization hitting him like a car on the road. The only way to contact the ACG now was through the special pup tag that they have given him. A pup tag which had been thrown aside in the boiler room, along with the only weapon. "Shit!" Chase said quietly, darting his eyes around as he cursed himself over and over for discarding the only means of communication he had. He had to get back to Sky, get back and retrieve his gun and tag. He just had to get back to the elevator. "Chase!" Marshall quivered, starting to hyperventilate. "Just stay here," growled the shepherd, as he took a step outside the kennel to the rain. The most violent, brutal changing sound suddenly howled throughout the air, deafening all 4 dogs on the metal roof was kicked out, steel bolts and fillings flying off and dropping to the floor like used cigarettes. The rest of Rubble's kennel quickly caved in, crashing to the ground like a large scrap heap. Just dust filled the air. Chase instantly retracted back to Marshall's den like a fearful turtle. There was a solid moment of silence in the air, nothing but rain hitting the roofs able to be heard. Swallowing his instincts, Chase crept forward again, peeking outside from his position. He could see the ruins of the yellow kennel, nothing more than a massive pile of wood and metal. Keeping as low as he could, Chase couldn't take his eyes off of the wreckage, too fearful to make the smallest move. A distant hissing sound filled the air of the clearing, which quickly darkened into a low, bear-like growling. It then stood up. The creature stood on 4 legs and reared up to its full, terrifying height, no longer bound to the low ceiling of the kennel. Chase's eyes widened at its height, watching its height rise above the kennel as his head picked up. The puppy stood horrified at the sight. The monster's body resembled that of a loved 4-legged monster. It was composed entirely of a long-finned skeleton, crudely wrapped in bleeding raw muscles and pulsating organs as shown in the white rain. Blue veins wrapped around its torso, bleeding down its arms and up its neck like netting. Intestine-like organs wrapped around its legs like ribbon, as if it had stolen Rubble's insides to build up its body. It was a creature that haunted nightmares, a stinted monster of gore and innards that lurked within the darkness of the mind. Its head was the only vaguely normal feature. It was the head of a shepherd-like dog, only with its torn and shredded along the mouth and around the eye sockets. One of its tall ears was ripped apart, making one wonder if it was merely skin mask for the grotesque animal that wore it. Chase briefly questioned how a monster that erupted from a bulldog would look like a shepherd, until he remembered that the Varrock likely carry the DNA of someone dead, and anyone is infected, even between different bodies. Then another thought entered his mind, overriding the previous one. Had Rubble cut the mask from a victim long ago, and was merely keep it stored away until it was time? Chase couldn't figure out which scenario he preferred. For all he knew, the face it wore could have belonged to a poor dog that fell victim to the monster long time ago. It was near impossible to see any trace of Rubble in the monster. His organs and innards had been assimilated into the Varrock's body. The remains of frozen of dozens of other dogs absorbed within it. Varrock's quivered in place for a moment, seemingly twitching as if getting accustomed to being exposed again. Chase swore it was a trick of its eyes, but he drew back in horror as the intestine-like tentacles began to emit from the monster's back. They thrive like living worms, almost with a mind of their own, tearing out the Varrock's like a squirming appendages. Taking a deep breath of air, Varrock's raised its elonged front leg, so thin that it could have been more than a few inches in diameter, and planted down in the mud, its paws built from the clumps of muscle mass, with long razor-like claws jutting out. "Dear God," Chase could barely whisper, as he watched from Marshall's kennel, sounded more like a cry. Taking a few large, slow steps forward, Varrock's growled and it looked around, curling its lips to reveal the glistening fangs, scanning for the clearing for the ears of its mask, pricked as the blood was dripping from its mouth. Its body emitted its sounds as it moved, the paws, if one could recall them, that would scrunch onto the ground, tapping its claws impatiently. Its bones almost constantly popped with each movement, each step radiating the same sound as anyone when cracking their knuckles. A thin tail that consists of a single rope-like strand of intestine followed, gracefully moving through the air. Despite having no skin below the neck and being a mere amalgamation of bone and muscle, unnatural physicality kept its body functioning to near perfection. Cyrus did say it escaped from a facility, long under the nose of hundreds of scientists studying the fascinating biology. After a moment it reared its head back, taking a large gulp of air, when it snapped forward, unhinging its fanged mouth and releasing a distressing, inhumane, and animalistic roar that penetrated the air. Its screech was loud, cutting into Chase's eardrums and forcing them open, reaching its claws in and gripping his brain. Marshall threw himself under his bed and the scream filled the air while Rocky retracted another to his table. Zuma stood in the den, his den eye wide, as the monster's roar freezing him in place, swirling around him like a tornado of fire. The scream Varrock's emitted was an unholy combination of several noises. The sounds of people screaming for their lives, old and young, dogs, cats wailing in agony as they were cornered, all other screams from countless livings that would impossible to label. All the victims, all their voices and tongues were stolen away to produce a terrible sound emitted from its maw. The roar seemed to have an effect on those around it. Chase for a moment felt oddly calm, but he quickly snapped back to reality as he watched the creature. The monster gore breathed out a feral snarl and then began walking out of view to its worm-like tail following behind it. Chase quickly eyed the elevator to the tower. The urge to sprint was incredible. His vision trailed to the kennels, all dormant vehicles waiting to be activated. Was this even possible to drive away? The simple act of starting the engine would immediately alert the creature with its noise, exposing the driver as if it was a giant spotlight shining on them. It was too dangerous of an option, prompting a whimper from Chase as he looked backward towards the elevator. Blinking in confusion, he realized the Varrock's miles had completely left his field of vision, leaving him with Marshall in a storm of terror and uncertainty. Looking back, he realized spotted the small head of a Dalmatian peeking under a bed. The spotted puppy was visibly breaking down. "What's happening?" Marshall squeaked, a tear forming streaks down his face. Grimacing, Chase crept over to his friend and tried to speak as softly as he could. "Marshall, do you remember those drills we practiced, where I would make everyone get under a table and be quiet?" The Dalmatian nodded. "Well, this is what we practiced for," he sighed, trying to hide his own fearfulness. "Hide and don't come out until I say so. I'm handling this." The smaller dog nodded. As fervor, he hid under the bed. "Okay." Trying to regain his composure, Chase turned and took a step outside. A pounding thump suddenly sounded, directly above them on the kennel. It was so abrasive and quick that the whole team swayed. The shepherd froze mid-step, turning back to see Marshall about to scream, already opening his mouth. Within a second, Chase jumped across the floor and clamped his paw over the Dalmatian's mouth, suppressing his cry. The sound of something large slowly dragged itself onto the roof above them, scratching its claws along the metal roof, hissing as it gained higher ground. Chase had to nearly suffocate Marshall as he drove his paw into the Dalmatian's mouth. He spotted the dog was shaking, losing control of himself, and with one wrong move, he could panic and doom them all. A long slivering appendage of intestine and suddenly dropped down in front of his right eyes before the puppy's eyes. Marshall was still silenced, but his eyes went wide, and Chase couldn't help but draw back himself. They stood motionless as the Varrock's tail slowly slivered around, briefly gazing over the kennel. It pulled to the side out of view, as Varrock's turned around, stalking the roof as its body bristled. Unsatisfied, it growled and moved off to the kennel. Chase continuing to hold his friend down as they witnessed its legs step down in front of them. It was hunting them. It would not leave the area until every single living creature in the area was ripped apart and consumed. It was unclear just how intelligent it was. Was it truly overlooking its prey in the obvious kennels, or was it merely toying with them? Varrock's was a vicious creature, but it was so sadistic and basked in the sphere, suffering with the others. Chase watched as it sulked away, walking it off as it went around the back of the tower, its tentacles and tail trailing behind it like a bloodied floating ribbons. The creature was unnaturally fast, its slow moving at the beginning merely being that of a morning stretch. It moved quickly, walking through the clearing only for a few seconds. Chase shuddered at the thought of it running. If there was any window of time, it was now. "I'm going," Chase said, as he released Marshall, who collapsed to the floor. His friend attempted to respond, but made a small choking noise, and then suddenly they threw up on the floor. The tense anxiety and confusion had taken control of his stomach from him. "Like I said, hide," the shepherd repeated one last time, grimacing at Marshall's condition. Taking a deep breath, Chase walked out of the kennel into the rain, exposing himself to the open. At first he tried to stay low, walking past each kennel and getting glimpses of the other dogs hiding. He couldn't hear or see the creature, only distant growls and faint rustling noises, moving what felt like ages. But the shepherd didn't dare do anything more than the crouched walk, even with his tail dragging in the mud behind him, was making him paranoid. A sudden urge to cough tickling up his throat, his heart beating seemingly louder than overhead thunder. Chase had crawled through the open doors to the elevator. He had to get back into the boiler room, retrieve his gun and radio, and it would all be over. He cursed himself for not seeing it at rubble earlier. Surely there had been some early warning signs that he was not himself. Whatever it had been, it was completely flew over his head, careful not to make a sound. He reached his paw out in front to the buttons. The sound kind of busting metal filled the air, making Chase jump in surprise. He jerked away and looked around fearfully, but he saw nothing. In an instant, the lights to the elevator flickered, before completely going dead, bathing him in darkness. What? The puppy quivered, racing to the buttons and pressing them. The elevator was unresponsive, even as he yet hit every button he could. No, he breathed out, began to panic. You bastard! It cut the power and completely blocked off the elevator access. Ferox Miles had actually found the outside breaker box, the hub for all electric systems of the tower, and damaged it. How in the world did it know how to do that? It would know if it know what a breaker box was. How would it even have the native understanding to know how to destroy it? Chase shuddered as hundreds of questions filled his mind, terrorizing it as he realized how exposed he was. Ferox Miles was more than any kind of animal in the world had seen. The way it tore down the metal sheet was Rubble's kennel. The sheer amount of hysteria it caused from just emerging, and its intelligence Cyrus had warned him was so desperately about. It clearly possessed a high congestive and even more humane level of understanding and problem-solving to deliberately recognize the advantage and snapped it like a twig, hunting it with its dreaded strength and its ability to hide within bodies as mere cell. It was a beautiful predator, it animalistic perfection of every sense of the word, a higher organism along static-minded animals, a true perfect creature. Chase frantically looked around, trying to find anywhere to go. He was sitting ducking as he deactivated the elevator. It would take all of its passing glance just beside to see him. If the monster was truly toying with them, how long until it ended the game, forcing into the kennels and tearing them apart one by one? Without thinking, Chase ran, jumping out of the elevator and running back to the nearest kennel. As he sprinted into Zuma's place, quickly getting against the wall, the lab jumped in surprise action. Ah! Said the frightened dog, quickly recoiling. Dude, don't do that! Quiet! Snapped the shepherd, motioning for him to shut up. I need to go upstairs. Why? You can't leave us down here. I left. There's a radio in the boiler room. He quickly corrected them. If I get it back, I can alert the ACG and get them here to contain that thing. So why don't you? Zuma said, looked around fearfully. The distant sound of growling was encircling the tower, and was quickly lowered himself and moving closer to a corner. Because that thing cut the power. Zuma's eyes went wide. It knew how to do that? I don't know what it knows, Chase said, his voice shaking. And I'm not going to take any chances with it either. Well, now what? The lab said with a hiss. Are we just gonna die here? No, I have a plan, he reassured. Stay here. I wasn't fucking going anywhere else, Zuma growled, retracting further. Taking a brief outside, Chase caught a glimpse of what he thought were tentacles disappearing behind some trees. The rain made it more difficult to see, and he knew the Ferox Miles had no intention of leaving. Slipping outside, he quickly made his way over to Rocky's kennel, trying to ignore the pounding distress in his heart. As he tried as hard as he could to show the other dogs that he wasn't afraid, yet a part of them wanted to crawl under a bed and hide until all the noises ceased for good. He came to the front of the green kennel and saw the door had been closed. Looking around fearfully, Chase tapped on the door. Rocky, it's me. Open the door. No response. Rocky, come on, he hissed. Knowing how invulnerable he was out in the open, It's me! The several uncomfortable seconds outside, he heard the mix shuffle up to the door and nose it open. Chase? He was interrupted as the shepherd wedged his own nose in front of under the door and forced it open, jumping inside. The officer shut the door as quickly as he entered, breathing heavily as he turned to his friend. I can't just sit out there forever, you know. Sorry, Rocky lowered his head, then looked out. That thing, what is it? I really don't know, Chase said, looking over at Rocky's tools, but it's lethal and pissed off. What are we supposed to do? The mech silently stared, hyperventilating. We're just puppies. I have a plan, the shepherd nodded, and then turned back to look at his friend. But I need your help. My help? Coming forward to the mech and sitting down in front of him, Chase reached out from his front paws and grabbed Rocky's shoulders, pulling him close. Rocky, you need to listen to me. The mech nodded, although uncertain. I don't know anyone better with machines than you, he explained. I need you to go out there. What? Rocky recoiled in his grip. What? It's simple, really. The simplest thing you could ever do, Chase assured him, keeping a hold on the mix. I need you to look at the breaker box and find out how we can fix it. We need power back in the tower. It's imperative. There are no one else here who knows how to do something like that, he said, drawing out his word to make sure Rocky was processing it. I'd go with you, but two would draw more attention and probably get us both killed. Go out there? Rocky breathed. With that thing walking around? If you see or hear it, hide, the shepherd explained. Be as quiet as possible. Do not run unless absolutely necessary. Does it have heat vision? Chase blinked, looking aside for a moment. I mean, Cyrus never really said anything about that. If it did, it probably would have found all of us by now. He didn't want to scare the mix any more than he probably already had been. But running was likely a death sentence if Varrock's Miles was truly fast, as he was suspecting. Trying to outrun it was not an option. Rocky stammered, shaking. Get over here, Chase instructed. Look over the breakers. Come back and tell me how you could fix it. Hide if you see or hear anything. Got it? After a moment, Rocky nodded fearfully. I'm counting on you. Chase licked his friend's nose, trying to get his tail wagging, smiling or anything to ease his fears. The storm surged overhead as Rocky left his kennel. His legs were shaking as he stepped outside into his worst nightmare. Rain, he breathed out, cringing to himself. He was willing to brave the water for the sake of the mission, but he was beyond uncomfortable. It was the worst experience Rocky had ever put himself into. Not only was he walking out into the groping hands of cold rain, but there had been actively a threat lurking outside, seeking to tear him to pieces. A shiver ran through his body as he was already freezing cold. Oh, okay, he breathed for himself, glancing behind him. Breaker box. Willing his paws to start moving, he crept up past Zuma's kennel, wincing as he waded through the puddle that came up to his chest. Horrid memories returned to him the farther he sunk into the mud, creeping up his neck and staining his fur with dirty sludge. Searing static began to leach in his head as he passed the elevator, a distant ringing in his ears as his breathing quickened. Looking around, he didn't see the Varrock's Miles anywhere. Had it walked off? Shaking its head as the noise and static, Rocky crept behind the tower, keeping an eye out and doing his best to mentally block out the cold and keep the blades of the grass that brushed up against his stomach as he pressed over, where bringing back dark memories. But all he wanted to know now was to prove that he wasn't weak, as he barely survived the ACG's brutality. Rocky knew it was hard that his patrol's weakling, but that had to change. Facing death was not the method he had planned on using. He turned the corner, checking the surroundings. Varrock's Miles was again nowhere to be seen, and Rocky raised an eyebrow. Suddenly his heart sank as the realization hit him, as he slowly looked upwards. He saw nothing but the sky, and let out a deep sigh of relief, although anxiety still churned within him. Finally approaching the large breaker box that sat and bolted into the wall, the mix could already see sparks flying out of it. With one final look around, Rocky hurried over to the front of it and investigated the damage. The box had been smashed inwards, likely from the Varrock's Miles striking it bluntly. The damage was minimal, but it still left the tower powerless. The breakers for the elevator and upper floors were completely destroyed and would have to be entirely replaced. Not all the breakers had been broken, however, as Rocky could see one labeled Basement Systems. It was still on a green light. "I didn't know we had a basement," he thought out loud, then wondered if it were where Ryder had been building their things all these years. It could be repaired, but he knew he had to need a special tool too. The breakers had been carefully removed and possibly could be rewired just for good measure. He needed a particular tool to remove the breakers from the box, a tool he absolutely didn't have, but if Ryder completed most of his builds in the basement, it was likely a location to find it. Rocky nodded and turned to head back. The ground suddenly moved from beneath him, making him sway and taking the mix off guard. He stumbled to keep himself standing, his fear returning to him as he was unsure of even moving. A large, fuzzy gopher quickly popped out of the ground, spraying dirt across the small radius. He seemed scared, and Rocky was about to approach him when his instinct suddenly froze a step. The gopher ran away seemingly from nothing, as fast as its little legs could carry it. Like a bullet through the air, and a bloody tentacle shot out from the tall grass, completely skewering it through the gopher's body like a spear. Biting back a scream, Rocky had backed away as a screaming rodent was lifted off the ground, the appendage firmly ensnarling through it. Emerging from the darkness, Varrock's Maul stood up and stared it down at its prey, its tail brutally speared through it, and it had been waiting, sitting patiently somehow, the lurid animal out of its safety. The gopher was lifted up before the creature's eyes, tiny gargled screams filling the air as the predator stared into it. Overcome with fear, Rocky broke into a sprint, his mind going override and spiking his flight instinct. All he could hear was the carnage by the gopher's screams that were pulled from the vocal cords and swallowed by the monster. The static in his head seemed to explode, almost fully taking control of him as he ran dangerously close to the creature as he passed. Rocky finally tore back into his kennel, sobbing as he drove inside. Chase quickly shut the door and wrapped around the terrified Mix in a hug. They had made progress now, but Varrock's Maul wasn't finished with them yet. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.